Everybody, welcome back to the Insiders Lounge. Today we have another special episode and a little bit of a different one here. We've got two guests on and we're discussing player workload management, all around, I think, a very relevant topic at the moment. So, Rich, if you want to kick us off with a quick introduction, then Joel, and then we'll get into things.
Sure, Chad. Thanks for having me. Rich Buchanan, 20-year vet, probably, of working in professional football. Started out all those years ago as a physiotherapist, working to rehab players coming back from injury. That evolved over time. Ended up as a performance director at a Premier League club, managing the kind of multidisciplinary team behind the team, everything from doctors, psychologists to chefs and travel managers. Then went to work for the Premier League and helped set up their academy audit company. So just the performance and medical criteria around that whole audit process. And then the last 4 or 5 years, I've kind of migrated a little bit outside of the game to the vendor side, servicing the game. So working for tech companies that supply everything from AI to Premier League teams to wearables to grassroots teams and advise those companies really how to navigate the football world essentially. So yeah, that's a whistle stop tour of my 20 years in football.
Yeah, thanks, Rich, and greetings from Mexico City. Great to be here. Great to be back, Chad, and thanks for the opportunity. Slightly atypical background, as some of your listeners well know. Began life in property, worked as an architect, and that took me from the UK to Mexico City about 15, 16 years ago. And during that time, I started working with young people, having worked in international language schools before in both the UK and Chile. And I set up some soft skills workshops to support self-confidence, some of the topics that we're getting to today around well-being and so on, and took that service to Mexican football clubs, Liga MX clubs, really to try and to support the person behind the performer from their perspective. It got me into an inner circle, really, in Mexico, and started to sort of unpick some of the topics that we'll discuss today. I then moved from Mexico to Singapore, carried on that work, working with pros, student athletes, and then moved back to the UK about 3 years ago. Continued the work, went back to school, did some further training in elite athlete wellbeing management, some player care and talented athlete lifestyle support work. Fast forward to today, where I work with pros, some TAS athletes, so talented athletes, scholarship scheme athletes from various sports, from boxing to fencing, all the way through to gymnasts, and obviously professional players as well, both in the UK, Spain and Denmark. So there's a bit of background there, and as I said, excited to be here, so thank you.
Of course, yeah, it's such a great topic, and now hearing your backgrounds and kind of the expertise behind it, it's great. It's really getting me excited to dive into things. Rich, I think if you want to start with just player workload, when we're discussing the physical aspects of it, what does this actually mean? What is this topic that we're discussing today? And then we can kind of dive into everything else behind it, sort of the mental side and so on.
Yeah, sure. I think for the observer of the game, you typically see the 90-minute product there or thereabouts every weekend, or maybe more than that, once or twice a week throughout the week. But there's a lot of work behind the scenes that kind of goes unseen, and that constitutes the bulk of the workload, right? So what you essentially get is the competitive schedule, and then the coaching staff and the performance support staff, the medical staff, they kind of periodize their inputs and the training workload that the athletes, the players go through to prepare for each game. So if you think about it, let's just say there's a Saturday to Saturday game sequence. As soon as that game on a Saturday, the first Saturday's finished, you're starting the recovery and preparation process for the next game. So you kind of have a forward-looking perspective of match day +1, match day +2 as a recovery period. But then you kind of complete that recovery period and it gets flipped, and you're almost working back then from the next game. So match day -1, -2, -3, -4. So that's the kind of very, very headline way that you would periodize the week, and each day will have certain inputs around the physical prep, the tactical prep. to ensure that the players recover appropriately, then get a physical stimulus which gets tapered so that they can go into the next game in an optimal state for their sort of maximized performance potential. If you break that down into its kind of physical parts, if you like, there's lots of demands, right? There's the external physical load. You know, how far do they run? How fast do they run? How many times do they change direction? Accelerations, decelerations. And I like to use the analogy of that's the chassis, the player's chassis that's under stress, under workload. Then you have this, what's termed often internal workload, the physiological element, the energy systems that they're using. You know, are they being trained to stimulate the kind of endurance aspect of their physical fitness? And then, you know, there's other elements where it's slightly more intermittent or, you know, repeated sprints, things like that. So this is how hard the engine is working, if you like. And then sort of woven into all this kind of physical workload that's going on is this emotional workload, if you like. Did they win the last game? Did they lose the last game? And I'm sure Joel will touch on the well-being side. But, you know, sometimes that affects how the external and the internal workload stresses get kind of like processed and dealt with by the individual as well. So, you know, it's multifactorial, and I'll probably end up saying that word, you know, lots of times during this conversation. But, you know, there's lots that goes on between competitive fixtures that, let's just say, the casual fan observes.
Yeah, I think well said. From a casual fan's perspective, you don't really realize the workload that actually goes into a player behind the scenes, but also the relationship between the well-being and the emotions and the mental side with the physical side. And I think that's important. So Joel, if you would like to kind of introduce the mental health sort of side of things, the well-being of the actual player themselves, and then we'll kind of get into that bridge between the two.
Yeah, thank you. I think Rich talked a lot of those topics about the sort of behind the curtain pieces that the casual observer doesn't see, and they're a lot harder to manage and measure. And I want to introduce a concept. It's not my work. It's developed in the late 80s around the term allostasis, which is effectively your body's ability to push down an accelerator in its body budget as it adjusts to external stresses. That's a very normal function of any human being, and athletes are exceptionally good at this, so they can tap on the gas when need to and come off it when not to. But I think as we talk through this conversation, we understand how workload has increased and what that means just away from minutes on the pitch. We can get into the pressing down of this gas pedal and this overloading, this allostatic load, being a significant burden both on physical and on mental health. So if we just unpick some of those things, that journey time, the sort of, as Rich said, the day plus one, the periodization of how you're preparing, we're talking about increased instances of fear of failure from an athlete's perspective. We're talking about potential external stressors that may impact quality of personal relationships at home and dragging that on to a performance situation. Increased media scrutiny. The more you play, the more the travel. You've not only got obligations as an athlete, but you're going to read more about performances. This all contributes to your allostatic load, which you're carrying around with you even before you set foot on the pitch and cross the line. And what happens is, as I said earlier, we've got this incredible ability to respond as all human beings, and that's why we've been able to live in, you know, the desert all the way through to, say, ice-capped mountains and everything in between. The point is that process of stepping on the gas is exactly that. It's a response to a temporary moment. But that temporary moment is becoming more and more and more permanent, with more and more instances of pushing down on the gas pedal. And it's not sustainable, and it means increased risk of injury. Serious mental ill health conditions can develop over time, and even worse down the line, maybe some very serious health conditions. So as a concept, I would like to introduce that and pick at it as we talk further. But some of those things around media commitments, personal relationship, lack of recovery time, so quality of routine and sleep. Obviously, nutrition can be affected. those multifactorial elements that Rich alluded to, there's a whole nother side away from the physical, which perhaps doesn't get the attention that it deserves.
Now that we've kind of like kickstarted into getting an understanding of, okay, this is what we're actually looking at in terms of the topic, player workload, I want to get into now, when has it sort of become an issue? Has it always been an issue in terms of the over workload, or is this something more recent? And then also, as a part of that, how is it measured? How do we know players are working? Obviously, you can see, okay, they're training or they're practicing more or they're playing more in terms of their games. But I'm curious how it's measured, especially on the mental health side. So maybe Joel, if you want to start in terms of how are we measuring that players' minds are overstrained now, compared to the physical side, where we can kind of measure, okay, yeah, they've played X amount of games this year, so we know they're playing more.
Yeah, that's a better question than there is a nice, neat answer to. And I think that's one of the issues as to why well-being concerns aren't so naturally or openly discussed, because they are by definition a lot harder to measure. But we know anecdotally from speaking with coaches, players, and the instances of injury, this is an ongoing concern. We are talking about a very, very small percentage of athletes who are entering into an unsustainable workload. And I think the average sort of game time is still quite low. You know, we're still talking about 24, 25 matches a season across a significant cohort. The FIFA Pro reports on the 1,500 players is slightly more, because they're looking at the elite of the elite. But it's incredibly difficult to measure beyond the instances of games. The pieces behind the curtain that I talked about, lack of sleep, impact on nutrition, potential stresses with media, family and friends, relationship. I think we need to speak more to players and give them space to talk about some of those issues and how that's impacting them, and say that's very normal. You know, we want high challenge. You know, we want the best athletes to be at their best for the longest period of time, but we also want high support. We want to be able to offer those athletes who are, you know, to carry on Rich's sort of analogy of a Formula One car, a chassis. We need to be able to have a big pit crew supporting that athlete at times to ensure that they have the tools to manage that increased load. What are the techniques to ensure that your sleep hygiene is strong? What are the sort of psychological tools within the kit that enable you to talk about and label emotions with friends and family in a psychologically safe space? That is the support piece that I still believe is significantly missing from a lot of sports organizations, and having more and more impact down the line as to players' ability to recover, get stuff off their chest, and get into sort of meaningful conversations about how they're feeling. I think that's the gap. In terms of measuring that, I think just more opportunities to have those conversations and listen to players, to want to support them, rather than listening and thinking, okay, well, that's a bit of information that's going to help me around selection.
Yeah, Rich, and I think if you want to touch on sort of from the club side, your perspective on that interaction with the mental health and sort of well-being side, but then also from the physical toll, what does that look like?
Sure. Just following on from Joel there, I think that's really poignant what he's saying, and it is in my experience that the piece that's often overlooked. I think awareness is growing through, you know, advocacy and you know, public awareness and whatnot around that kind of mental, psychosocial, call it what you want, aspect. And I'd also throw in often the team behind the team supporting the athletes often need that as well, because they're under performance pressures of their own. Also, you know, having to follow the competitive schedule, much like the players. The media scrutiny can sometimes be on that, you know, team behind the team as well. So the ability for them to be kind of have the pressure valve released as well, I think is important. There's a performance director in the MLS that explained to me, you know, when they fly cross country and they land back in their home city at 2 a.m. What people don't realize is there's then a bus journey across the city back to the training centre, and then there's time having to unload the bus, and then there's the drive back home. So whilst they may land in their city at 2 a.m., they get home at 5 a.m. and they're the team that are supporting, the talent, the athletes. So, there's a whole piece there as well. And I think the work that Joel does and people like Joel is super, super important for the athletes, but also those that are at the coalface with the athletes. I digress a little bit there, but there was a point that I thought I really wanted to make. But specifically on the physical side, I think there's some research from way back when in 2014 that showed a significant increase in physical demands in the Premier League between the seasons 06-07 to season 2012-13, something like a 30% increase in high-speed running, a 35% increase in sprint distance, and 80% increase in number of sprints. Real significant numbers. Now, that research is 10 years old, and I think there was some other research that kind of followed that up, published a year or two ago, by some practitioners, again in the Premier League, Tom Allen, Matt Taberner, et al., that showed that those numbers have increased again, not quite as significantly, but, again, a moderate increase in what you would term the kind of high intensity physical metrics. So it does show that the players are being asked more of certainly in the game, the competitive, element of the whole process. So that's a workload increase there, just with basic raw numbers. Why? Well, I think players have got fitter, faster, stronger, so therefore they're more capable of producing these, bigger physical outputs. I think there's also like a cyclical game model trend. So perhaps rewind 10 years, and the in vogue style of football might have been that sort of Barcelona tiki-taka style, and fast forward a few years and it's a little bit more the sort of high press, high intensity actions popularized by a Jurgen Klopp's Liverpool, for example. So the game models, the tactical game models changing will change the demands on the players. I think the extreme example would be a Bielsa team who asks his players to go and go and go and go and go, and potentially if there's casualties, so be it. That's the remit. Is that the right thing? That's a whole debate in itself, right? But there's a definite game model causation to, I suppose, increased physical workload. Question mark. Does the schedule increase the workload? Possibly. I think that there's certainly more kind of high stakes business in the modern game than there perhaps was in years gone by. Therefore, the expectations and the demands to succeed are much higher, not just from a, hey, we won performance perspective, but for a bigger picture perspective. So I think there's, again, lots of factors to that. But humans are still humans. It still takes, a period of time to recover. Neuromuscular fatigue is still sort of normalizing 48 hours post-game, 72 hours post-game. How you quantify that psychologically, I'm going to bounce that right back to Joel. If you can, maybe you can't. But, again, humans are still humans. They may be able to physically produce more for one reason or another, but you still need that, that sort of peaking and troughing of preparedness, which comes back to the whole kind of like periodization model. And sometimes that periodization model is dictated too by the schedule.
Yeah, again, it's some real wise words there and a lot of insight. I agree. I think the challenge over the years, the fitter, faster, stronger model, is just the way most sports have gone, and athletes have become fitter, faster, stronger. But I also think there's some other examples that have been referenced recently. So Jude Bellingham, outstanding player from the outside looking in, with a pretty strong team behind the team, but has played 5 times the amount of minutes that David Beckham had at the same age of 21. Vinicius Junior, 3 times the amount of minutes that Ronaldinho have played at 23. So we're getting this increased workload as well as a higher quality workload, which is often the nature of competitive sport. But I think, as I said earlier, as that challenge goes up incrementally, maybe over the last 10, 15 years, the physical support has certainly sort of looked to keep pace with it in terms of the science around the information. But I think the well-being support has remained relatively low, and therefore that gap between the sort of challenge and support has grown wider and wider and wider. And I think therein lies the risk of injury, of mental ill health concerns. And we know across the top 5 European leagues, approximately 75% of all reported injuries were soft tissue injuries. And I would claim that a lot of that allostatic load of the points that I mentioned earlier are contributing to the body's physical response to the ever-increasing mental demands, because, lovely phrase, Rich use, humans are still humans, and they will react in a certain way to tell you that you're being overloaded, you're being overworked, and you are spending far too much time in that red zone, as FIFA Pro and Arsene Wenger has spoken about in the past. And so therefore, we need a team of dedicated, educated professionals that are there supporting the athlete, supporting the non-playing staff, about issues, self-care, how to regulate that stress, know what to look out for as well. And I think finally, just wrapping up from my side, one of the big stresses that often isn't considered when we're asking athletes to go and travel these crazy distances. I think Chelsea, Thursday before last, 16,000 kilometre round trip to southern Kazakhstan, 8 hours there, a game, 8 hours back. They got some discompensation to play Brentford later on in the evening. But the point is, one of the biggest stresses for a human being is not knowing what you're walking into. So if we apply that model to, say, commercial, Starbucks, McDonald's, and many other businesses are so popular because the brain knows what they're going to get before they've asked the question. If you're in the UK or Mexico or the US, if you order X, Y, Z, you're going to get X, Y, Z. The brain saves energy because it understands the answer before asking the question. When we apply that model to these big travel distances and these extra challenges, the shifting of routine, different scenarios around physical environment, different media commitments, all of those things are significant stresses because there's a gap between the sort of expectation and reality, which is a massive stressor to the human. And I think that plays out over time too. That lack of routine, changing dinner time, it's incredibly stressful on the body and not sustainable. So I think that's something that just needs to be made more aware of. I do think the zeitgeist is shifting with some great conversations, some programs recently. Tony Poulis heading up the Chasing the Dream documentary with Sky Sports, which looks at the academy system and the increasing pressure on that. But it needs to be more central to coaching education and support staff, so they're aware of these issues rather than, well, I believe the model is at the moment, reacting to athletes moving into a sort of languishing state or physically or mentally injured, and then everyone's scratching their head saying, well, what's that all about? But actually it's been building up for 18 months plus. So I think it needs to be a lot more proactive rather than reactive in that respect.
I'm going to continue playing the role of sort of the curious kid here, I guess you could say. You both kind of discussed the idea of the commercial part of the game now bringing in a part of that influence. So I want to get into the why. Why are players playing more, and why is this affecting them? But can we get into kind of the more commercial aspects? So I know, Joel, you and I have kind of gone back and forth discussing this aspect of, okay, we have the commercial side of the game. It's clearly influencing the physical sort of the workload side of the game. But why is that actually happening? So can we discuss that a little bit more and maybe some of the new, I wouldn't say innovations, but the new ideas around the commercial side of the game, broadcasting rights, that sort of thing. And then we'll dive into that topic a bit more.
Yeah, I think it's very topical because all 3 European competitions have been expanded, I think, from 32 to 36 teams. The World Cup in 26, North American World Cup, the first time is going to be 48 nations. We've also got a massively expanded World Club Cup during the summer over in the US across 11 cities. Again, 30 plus teams involved in that. And the drivers behind all these expansions, it's no great secret, is the commercialization of the sport, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's showing that it's success, it's showing that it has a broader audience, and that increased money into the game. It's probably another conversation for another podcast, but has been relatively well distributed, and the quality of the game, I think everyone would agree, is never been so high. I think, to what point does that become oversaturated? And I think if we take the World Club Cup as an example, FIFA's difficulty in establishing both commercial and broadcasting partners up until very recently, and we'll touch on it a bit later on, is probably a little bit of an example of this sort of user fatigue as well. The subscription model to consume sport is very much saturated. So I think, one, there's a conversation about the saturation of football as a product, soccer as a product. But I also think the issue that I have from a well-being perspective is it again dehumanizes the people that are being asked to perform at this ever-increasing and ever more frequent level. It's sort of assuming that, quote unquote, players can just get on with it, and we'll just pay them a little bit more, or, well, aren't they lucky? Because actually that isn't how human beings operate. They need time to process, to recover, to digest, but also need to spend a lot of time working on a non-athletic identity away from the game. And you're nibbling into that as you increase these competitions and as you expand the calendar. And the net result, as of June this year, has been these 2 legal cases brought by a collective of player football associations, and FIFA Pro alongside the Euro leagues, challenging FIFA's monopoly over calendar. FIFA is saying, well, we only organise approximately 2-3% of all fixtures during a season. It's not us to blame. But I think they should be setting the example more. I think leagues together need to be looking at this, and this dehumanizing of the end athlete that's having to go out and perform is just not acceptable, in my opinion, and really needs to be woven into the fabric of this conversation.
Yeah, I think we've discussed it already, but I'll send it over to Rich now. Let's stick around kind of this commercial aspect of the game. I brought up even here the calendar of sort of the increase of fixtures. Do we think you can get to a point where players will be able to actually play this amount of games, or is it going to go to kind of like a workload management style that we see? I think we see it a lot more in North American sports. You've got your basketball, you've got even in the MLS, where you have a lot of rotation within the squad to allow for more games to be played. So I think that'll kind of counterbalance where you can play more games in terms of the commercial side increasing, so that you can sell more tickets, you can sell more viewership and so on. But then the players, the star players, I guess you could say, aren't played as often. I'm curious where you see things go here. Do you think players kind of go back and sort of use unions to fight back against this? Or is it more of a thing where we kind of transition into a different way of football that we've never seen before?
I mean, this is a super interesting topic, and Joel makes some fantastic points about saturation, and there I think lies a direct comparison to a North American sport that actually operates on a scarcity model, like the NFL. That's super successful, super popular, and it is kind of the one sport that blows all others out of the water in terms of revenues generated and global interest. That football can compare itself to, right? And it's a scarcity model that they operate. So I think football can learn lessons there, and actually sometimes more is not more. Does that mean that football can adopt the kind of best practices, I suppose, from the kind of franchise North American sports where, there's these like collective bargaining agreements and, centralized directives to enforce player rotation. I think in principle, these are great ideas. I think in practical application, certainly in the European model, where there isn't quite the same ability of centralized governance, if you like, to dictate these things, I think it's much more difficult to get off the ground and enforce. I wouldn't necessarily anticipate that happening anytime soon, but it's certainly a conversation that needs to continue to gather momentum, and hopefully the end result is some action that is like positively impacting player welfare for sure. I do think the collective bargaining type agreement, is an option that has to be explored between the unions and the leagues and the various governing bodies. Similar to what you find in the US, right? There's things like the winter breaks in leagues on the European continent that are well established. It's slightly more recently been adopted in the UK. How much that genuinely has a positive impact on player well-being and welfare broadly, I'm not too sure, because I think what you find is these winter breaks are enforced, but the clubs and the players then end up, having a very minuscule amount of time off, and then they're ramped up again, almost like a mini pre-season within the season. So, I'm not sure actually it's doing what it was intended to do, if that makes sense. But that doesn't mean none of these things should be explored and actioned. It's a journey of discovery, a journey of evolution, and absolutely, there's lessons that the European aspect of the game can learn from the North American model. It's just a different business model. Therefore, action in these things, is difficult.
I think you mentioned the NFL there, and what was interesting with them is when the players union and the league came together to discuss new compensation models, they realized that the league was never going to be able to reach the next sort of level of compensation that players were wanting. So players now actually practice less in the NFL in order to kind of relieve that compensation. But then I think that sort of decreases the quality of play on the field. So you kind of have this counterbalance of like, where do you find the healthy balance between that?
Sure. And it's elite sport is about performance as much as it's about business as well, right? I think, just trying to rewind the conversation a little bit, there's a great book that's probably, a year since it's been released, called The Sport's Perfect Storm, written by a guy called Roger Mitchell. And it talks explicitly to the kind of challenge that sport per se finds itself in at the moment, about how it finances itself in this saturated kind of landscape. The subscription broadcast model is almost the thing that I've grown up on and people of my generation have grown up on, but is that the way that sport is going to be able to finance itself with Generation Z, Generation Alpha, who actually, are brought up on these kind of like YouTube short type things and maybe don't want to be paying subscriptions to access sports. So sport's got some fundamental kind of horizon scanning it needs to do to figure out, how it's gonna finance itself, and that book, goes into super detail and explains these things far more eloquently than I possibly can. So I'd say it's a recommended read if people are interested in, in that kind of aspect of how sport finances itself, saturation versus scarcity, subscription model being a kind of like dying thing. Some super interesting thought provocation there.
We discussed briefly there the saturation, the idea of saturation in the commercial side. Joel, I know we were kind of going back and forth on this discussion where we're like, okay, is the Club World Cup going to get a broadcast deal? It's like sort of feeling like last minute, like we're counting down the months at this point to when something was going to get finalized. DAZN came in and completed that transaction. I want you to talk us through sort of, is that an ideal broadcasting deal for FIFA? Was this something that they were hoping for? What are the positives here? We're talking about saturation. So was this maybe too much and it's now a lesson learned and they can adapt in the future? I'm curious what your thoughts are, but also maybe what FIFA was thinking now and during this transaction.
I think ultimately it is a good deal for FIFA because they've got £1 billion in broadcasting revenue. I think they weren't expecting it, and the deal was announced, very late. It's the 8th of December, I think it was announced, just very recently. And I think FIFA believed they would get over the line with Apple in a similar way that the MLS have done, huge work with Apple and the Leagues Cup and so on. I think the bigger issue is some of the commercial partner take up is very low. We've got Hisense, AV InBev, and maybe one other, Budweiser. But I think from a sponsor's perspective, they're probably looking for that historical evidence around an expanded World Club Cup, which just isn't available to them. So it's very difficult for sponsors to make decisions based on having a very small data set to go off. Ultimately, it's probably a good thing for DAZN. The World Club Cup is being played in the summer. There's no European football, so there'll be a lot of eyes on. And it may well be a success. But I think the bigger picture here is athletes, fans, coaches, sponsorship ownership, sports group ownerships, and other stakeholders. They want to see the best soccer being played. And I think the amount of games, the amount of competitions means that ultimately the quality of the football is suffering. I think there's less entertainment. I think the Euros, goal scoring has suffered. I think if we look at the quality of some of the Champions League and even the Premier League matches, it's suffered, in my opinion. And I don't think anyone involved in any sport wants that. So I do believe that unions like FIFPro, who look after nearly 50% of global football players, need to come to the table with the FIFAs, the leagues, and ring fence recovery time and the amount of games played. I think that needs to happen, as seen in NBA, as seen in NFL, as seen in Australian rules football. I think that needs to come in. It's not going to be easy, but I think that's ultimately what needs to happen, because otherwise this thing's just going to run and run and run, and we're going to see some very, very serious negative outcomes from it.
You mentioned the unions there, obviously representing the players. We should get. It would be nice to have a player's perspective here, but I know you guys can at least talk on what players think. We were discussing just before the podcast how maybe players aren't necessarily against this. They're like, a lot of players are enjoying the aspect of playing more, maybe games, not necessarily the training workload, but the games aspect of it they're enjoying. Rich, I'm curious. We spoke about the article with Kimmich, and then obviously a few other players in the EFL Championship. This is maybe something that is a little bit obscure that fans might not think is happening behind the scenes, but players are actually enjoying this increased workload. I would love for you to kind of give us why they might be saying that and some of the reasons behind that.
This is a super interesting topic on its own, and I think what you'll find, a bit like you just said, is that players enjoy playing. That's why they play the sport. The consequences of playing more is everything that comes with it. I'd argue that players enjoy training as well. They're doing what they love. And if you're playing more, you're sometimes not training as physically as hard, but you're still tactically preparing, doing the recovery. So there's still this kind of holistic workload that Joel is talking about. I can't say the word that you talked, allostatic load, Joel. Is that what you said? There's still that factor at play. And players, like I said, are doing what they love. I think the negative outcomes, I suppose, from this never-ending more is more games, 12 months throughout the year of just constant football is the stuff that's unseen, that suffers, the social relationships, the mental well-being, because there's no decompression time. There is some physiological recovery factored in to prepare for the next game, but it's not holistic human, switching off recovery that, we've all been burnt out at some point in our own lives doing whatever it is we're doing. So, why should professional athletes be any different? I do think that professional footballers and other athletes do get into their kind of routine and their rhythm. So, let's say a European Champions League team plays, Saturday, Tuesday. A Premier League team might play Saturday. And players for those teams definitely get into their rhythms. So when you disrupt that rhythm, sometimes that has a negative impact on their performance because, it's not what they're used to. But I do think there has to be, as Joel termed it, that kind of ring-fenced recovery time just for the holistic well-being of players. And, it's the responsibility of all the game stakeholders to kind of find a way to make that happen. Otherwise, we are going to have this kind of snowball effect of negative outcomes and consequences. And, it's not just business and player well-being. It's the evaluation of the product, the quality of the product that the fan is consuming. So, it's all, as far as I'm concerned, kind of interwoven and it's a complex challenge, but, one that, like I said, all the stakeholders in the game, need to rise up to.
Mm. Yeah, just coming off the back of those really strong points, I think there's two very interesting surveys. FIFPro have been running a workload survey from about 2019, and in response, CIS have done their own survey. And interestingly, they look at very different things. The FIFPro report looks at 1,500 players and looks at minutes played. The CIS reports look at, sorry, start again, it's the other way around. FIFPro looks at squad involvement, and CIS looks at minutes played. And it's very interesting because if I use the analogy for all three of us here and say, okay, guys, we're going to have 10 Teams calls this week, but Chad, you're going to be on 2 of them, and Rich, you're going to be on 1 of them. The problem is you've still got these blocked out periods of time in your calendar, which, whether you like it or not, is going to increase your allostatic load because you're thinking about the calls, you're maybe having to log in or catch up on some notes, or maybe a bit concerned about what's being said. Am I missing out? So squad involvement, I think a third of players are involved in over 55 squad involvements on average, over 1,500 players that FIFPro looked at. Whereas CIS suggests that only 10% of pro players are playing more than 40 games a season. And if we go even further, we're talking about less than 1% that play over 61 games in a season. So we are talking about a very, very small percentage of players that are being pushed beyond their limit. And if you speak to the vast majority of players, there's approximately 130,000 pro players across the world. I would say around 90% of them say, yeah, we want to play more. We love the game and we want to be the best we possibly can. Please don't take that opportunity away from us. So I think that's a context thing. But I think if we shift the conversation away to what I was trying to articulate earlier, which is effectively about being listened to, by being validated, a sense of agency, that I think a lot of players, non-playing staff, feel like has been taken away from them by the power brokers who are saying, yeah, we're just going to expand all 3 European competitions and we're going to throw in a World Club Cup. Oh, by the way, if anyone's listening and didn't know, it's Real Madrid-Pachuca tonight in the Intercontinental Final. Just in case, we needed another game and another competition. I think it's that lack of agency. So players and coaches, Pep, Jose, Klopp, they've all said it out loud, and players, like Rodri and Alvarez and Bahrain have said, we're close to strike. But I think it's less about the number of players that are being played too much, and more about the fact that go back to, sure, you've got the high challenge, but where's the support? And where are we being heard as human beings? We're not. We're just being told what to do, how to turn up, and ultimately, humans are humans, as Rich said earlier on. They're not robots. They're not players. They're human beings being asked to undertake exceptional challenges, which is incredible what they achieve. But if you're not being heard and not being listened to and just being prodded and told what to do and when to do it, I think that's one of the worst things, athlete or non-athlete, that can trigger some serious mental ill health conditions. And I think that is the broader picture, rather than getting into the very small number of players that are perhaps being pushed to play beyond what would be defined as a safe workload.
You've transitioned to it perfectly. You mentioned to me the complaint of abuse of dominance from towards FIFA. Can you describe that overall complaint and then the legal proceedings? Like, is it something where we have to take a legal process towards something like this in order to see change? Where do you see that coming around?
Yeah, I think it's really sad, isn't it, that we've got to a point where people just aren't being listened to, and they say common sense is the least common of all senses. And I think as well, we know that sport often reflects society, and we live in a very polarized society where, he's wrong, she's right, fill in the blanks, where actually life is shades of grey, and it's about having conversations rather than hanging people out to dry and waving the finger. This non-judgmental mindset and, Dweck's work on growth mindset, I think we all recognize is a great place to be, rather than trying to desperately categorize who's right and who's wrong. And when that conversation breaks down and people don't feel like they're being listened to and they don't have that agency or validation, they seek a third party to step in and arbitrate between those parties. And in this case is a legal process, which there are two legal claims. One, as I mentioned earlier, FIFA Pro and the Euro Leagues, looking really at the dominance of FIFA in terms of calendar and competition, that they're just able to wave a magic wand. This is their argument, not my words. And there's a second claim brought collectively by PFAs, Italy, Spain, France, and England, I believe, which is more about the ring fencing and recovery and workload as it applies to European employment law. So there are some stats that suggest that players are no longer getting the mandated recovery time as a day off per week, and how that then doesn't correlate with European law in a broader conversation. So there's two tracks there. But I think stepping back from the minutiae of those legal claims, the point is that there's a massive breakdown of conversation. And we look at Mendy's recent court case against the City Group about unpaid wages. We look at other things going on around commercial deals, the resignation of the Mexican commissioner last week. This inability to have voices heard and listened to, rather than jumping and saying, well, that's wrong and that's right, and we're just going to fracture the whole football ecosystem, which I think is unfortunately a very strong reflection of the modern society, and has been seen in the last year as maybe 60-70% of the world voted, how polarized that conversation has sadly become, which, again, wrapping up, easiest job in the world being critic, and certainly we don't have all the answers. But unfortunately, that's where we're at. And maybe this is a watershed moment where people take a step back and say, well, it's far better to be slightly more proactive and have these open dialogues rather than going down a sort of legal ramification route. The lawyers are happy, of course, and they tend to be.
I think we've covered almost all the perspectives so far. I wanted to get your opinion on sort of the youth space now. So you mentioned kind of the idea of a routine where if a Champions League team plays on a Tuesday and a Saturday, a player can get used to that workload, where if he then switches to a bottom half Prem team, he's just used to the Saturday, and it can kind of throw off that balance. I'm curious, for a youth player breaking into a first team, is there support systems for that? Like you mentioned the tactical idea that sort of someone like Klopp or a Slot now that has come to Liverpool, their version of the way they play is very aggressive, very hard on a physical demands. So I'm curious, from the youth side, how do you see that sort of transition coming through, and is it possible for players to make that transition?
This is a topic that has probably dominated conversations internally at clubs for many a year, for lots of different reasons, and I'll touch on a couple. I think that there's an important distinction to make, that youth players from 9 to, let's say, 18, maybe a little bit older, they are on a developmental pathway. It's about treating children as children, and then as they mature and both physically, mentally, etc. You're preparing them for hopefully the outcome that everybody, is invested in, which is then becoming a professional player. It's a development space, and that, we shouldn't lose sight of that yes, there's an element of performance, but it's a development space. The senior game, the professional space, that's a performance space. So there's a clear kind of demarcation between the two environments. And then what you get with, I suppose, the best youth players is they bounce between the two. So not only do you have that change in intensity, physical intensity, psychological pressures, schedule differences that, you talked about, you also have that shift in mindset of it's performance versus, oh, this is a safe space where I can make mistakes, and it's okay because I'm on my development journey. So, there's loads of like nuanced elements at play here. The other thing to consider is often these players will perhaps train with the senior team because it's about exposing them to the next level and all that's involved with that, but then will compete with, the U18s or the U21s or the B team, depending on what, the environment setup is. And therefore their periodization, physically, mentally, etc., is all over the place. So they're not being set up for success in any shape or form. And how you manage these players is been the bane of club's life for, as long as I can remember, because they're the best of your academy development youth system, yet you're managing them in the most, inefficient, ineffective way. It's the nature of, the circumstance and the context and the environment and so on and so forth. So, like, I don't think anybody's got like the perfect answer here. But I think it's something that people, or the game, is very aware of, and probably, actually sometimes you're better off making a definitive decision that, if you're going to transition a player to a senior environment, that's where they stay. Obviously, if they're not going to play for the senior team, where do they get their match minutes? So, it's not an easy answer, but it's certainly asking a lot of, that young player that's trying to make the transition. And there's examples of players that have made the transition and competed. Joel, I think you mentioned about Bellingham and Vinicius Jr. I rewind 20 years and think about Michael Owen, came through as a 17-year-old, played in a senior environment. He did have a long career, but, his natural capabilities probably waned way too early. Maybe because he was exposed at a very young age and, suffered hamstring injuries, lost a yard of pace. Therefore, was he as effective as he, as an older player than perhaps he was when he was a younger player? Perhaps there's an example of it not working so well. There are other examples of it being successful. There's no right or wrong. So I think you have to take kind of each player, each situation on its own merits and do your best with the players' well-being, at the core of it.
Yeah, I think transitions is just a word that you hear a lot about football transitions in play, but transitions in a human's journey, and within the context of football, moving from school to an academy, moving from an academy into a development setup, moving from a development to a pro setup. We haven't touched on loans as well, which I think is another really often mismanaged process, I think, around the support and the communication, and that, what I said earlier about that lack of agency. Oh, you're going up here and then you're coming back, and that horrible feeling of not quite knowing what's going to happen. I appreciate it's a brutal sport and a brutal industry, and injuries and coach changes mean that there isn't always going to be certainty. That's the nature of the role. But I still think there needs to be far more communication and support towards playing and non-playing staff as to what's happening and when it's happening, as much as possible. And I absolutely don't believe there's enough. Maybe Premier League teams have 10 plus players out on loan. Often they feel very jettisoned. Some clubs have loan managers, but it's much more a technical approach rather than a well-being support role. Just going up, checking in, having some feedback sessions, making sure that these players still feel part of that family, and their understanding that this is part of a developmental journey. I think there needs to be far more work around that, and stakeholders again need to ring fence some of the protocols. It's a great mechanism, but as I've talked about a few times, there's the challenge going on loan, maybe overseas, maybe outside of the UK to Scotland or over to Ireland and vice versa. Who are the support team around that and managing that transition? And then finally, post game, that's another enormous transition. A lot of people don't have the agency of when their career comes to an end. Might be injury, might be a coach change, might be some legislative issues, might be, God forbid, a drugs test that means that your career is cut short. Fill in the blanks. And then what? How is the game then supporting players and that incredible wealth of knowledge, self-discipline, experience? It's just lost. And there's sort of finite opportunities within the media, but there's far more that I think can be done to ensure that investment in human beings stays within the ecosystem. And Tony Poulis's sort of suggestion of mentors coming in, up to 90 mentors coming in and working with young players, I think is a fantastic one. Again, there's more questions than answers as many of these conversations are, but I think just raising the awareness of these different stressor points and these different friction points is really, really important.
Joel, I wanted to get your perspective as well from the youth player side and sort of that mental well-being, your psychological perspective. Are players are you seeing an increase now where players are being more affected in terms of that side of things rather than the physical side? I'm sure coming up through the system, like we've mentioned now, you have some support systems in terms of helping you with that transition, but not a lot of it is focused on, okay, how are you actually doing? Like from the mental side of things, from the emotional side. Like I'm curious, have you seen trends shift now more recently with youth players transitioning?
Yeah, there's a lot in there. I think the overarching message is the trajectory's good. It's positive. It's moving in the right way. So we're moving from a very reactive piece, which was about safeguarding, welfare, player care, which is sort of picking up the pieces. Aftercare, another great term. You've missed the moment. We need to get further up the river and work with human beings as they come through this incredible formative experience. So they've got space to develop themselves as a human being, rather than the other end where people are just picking up the pieces and making sure there isn't this sort of crisis management of a message perhaps getting out from the club, which I still think a lot of the focus is on that. So yes, the trajectory is good. There's more support for youth players than there's ever been in the game. But I would also argue there's more places at academies than there's ever been in the game. So again, you increase that lever, you need to do that to go alongside it. Is there a gap? Yeah, it's massive. How many Premier League clubs have got a dedicated player care division with educated professionals, either from a learning perspective themselves or some supportive education around athlete well-being, that are interested in the development of the person? And how many are there really just to sort of concierge and butler players to make sure that they're not upset or agitating for a move? So I think that's the shift that still needs to happen, and we can take clues from player engagement model in North America, which I think is very strong, but also the other side of the world in Australia, the great work there in the rugby league and Aussie rules football and cricket, about understanding that, Rich's beautiful phrase, humans are humans and therefore need human support, regardless of whether they are Jude Bellingham or a young 12-year-old, who's coming into the system for the very first time. And I think that's the opportunity.
Rich, I know a lot of your day-to-day work is focused in kind of the sports tech world as a whole. I'm curious, from the technology side, are we seeing advancements or solutions to a lot of these problems that we've discussed in player workload that can actually now help not only the players, but help the clubs in terms of a revenue trajectory where they're now creating loss and helping them in their own end? I'm curious if there's different things that you've seen out there.
A whole topic in itself, yeah. as many of the points that we've talked about already are. I think technology affects society in lots of ways, right? We're all impacted by technology in our day to day, and professional sports no different, right? I think there's, been an explosion of tech and, subsequent data sets that are available, all designed to solve problems, inform the humans as to, how they might want to, make a decision, think, are you data led? Are you data informed? That's a debate in itself. And I think that the challenge is we're at danger or in danger of overloading the humans with information and data points that, can cloud our judgment and arguably lead us up a path that we don't want to go down when it comes to, taking care of human beings. That being said, I'm not here to be sort of dismissive about technology. Quite the opposite. I think what we have to do is be very realistic and go, technology is here to help. Let's make sure we understand, what our use case is, what technology is there that answers that use case, and how are we going to integrate it into our already well-established workflows and create a culture around this technology is there to help and aid our decision-making for looking after humans, athletes, overall well-being, performance potential, as opposed to just sort of casting the net wide, trying stuff, dismissing stuff. There needs to be a due diligence process, and I'm not sure that all sports organizations are well set up for that. Some certainly are, many certainly aren't. I think the buzzword AI is, dominating the landscape in our lives per se. And I heard a lovely phrase from Reid Hoffman on a podcast recently that said, actually, AI shouldn't be viewed as artificial intelligence, but amplification intelligence. And that is exactly what I would encourage practitioners using technology in the sports space to view it as a power tool in their armory of things that they can use, but to make, I suppose, better, more informed decisions, but to help them do the analysis piece around all this kind of data that's available to them more efficiently. So actually their workload is eased, and therefore they can impact the player, the athletes, in a much more effective, efficient way. I feel like I've rambled a bit there, but essentially technology is there to help. Let's just make sure that our process of deciding which technology is going to be impactful is a good one, and it's not just emotive, opinion based. It's clear, it's structured, and therefore we can trust the technology to do what it says on the tin effectively.
I'll give an example. I'm nowhere near a professional athlete, but I use a Whoop band, and it tracks my sleep. I track my eating habits on there, my fitness, everything. And even from that end, I see what you're saying, where you can sometimes look too much into it and you see all the numbers and it almost gamifies your life, where you're like, okay, am I like now in a video game, or can I just live a normal life? So I think it's even for myself, it's okay, how do I find a balance? But then you mentioned like AI, where I sit every morning and just talk to my Whoop and it talks back to me through AI, and it's just saying, okay, these are some of the things you should look for today. Try to relax today, or try to work a little bit harder in your workout. Like it gives you that, which I would have never known if I didn't have it on my wrist. So it's interesting to kind of find that balance, like you're saying.
Just two things that spring to mind is, one thing I hear a lot is, we want to be more data driven or data led. And I'm not sure that's true. I think we want to be more data informed, but still have that kind of humanistic executive decision-making function. And a colleague of mine is a doctor that works in the Premier League, said this a year or two ago, and it really resonated with me. He said, the artificial intelligence tool I use is a member of my multidisciplinary team. It has an opinion on the data set that it's analyzing for me. Sometimes I agree with it and it psychologically supports my decision making, and sometimes I don't agree with it, but that's okay. I don't always agree with my physio or my S&C coach. It's an opinion that we factor in and apply human filtering processes to before we make a decision and execute an action. And I love that. I think that's amplification intelligence, not artificial intelligence dictating to the experts in their lane. And that's, I think, a really nice place to be in terms of the tech space right now.
Joel, do you have any last points on that? And then we can start to wrap things up here.
Yeah, I do. I agree. I think technology is a fantastic thing, but I think technology changes and humans stay the same, right? It's an often quoted comment. My concern with technology is that it leans into a very modern science, and we're ancient beings that have been around for a very, very long time. And there's an ancient wisdom within all of us that I think technology does its very best to ignore. And the more we rely on technology for those data points and that information, the further and further we get from our core self as humans. And that's my concern around it, that it's the easy stuff. It's the easy question on the maths quiz that everyone rushes towards because it's pretty, we can quantify things. And as I said earlier, human beings love the answer before the question. And that's why it plays into being very attractive for human beings. It's why we put frames around maps and say, oh, I understand that. From a human lens and a modern wisdom you do, but in a deep emotional, sort of holistic and well-being perspective, a million miles away from meeting some of those needs. And that's my concern of its over-reliance, because it moves us further and further and further away from actually what we probably need, what we always need, and what we've always needed and what we will always need. If technology was so great, why have we? Why do people like plants in an office? Why do we love an open fire in a pub? And why do we walk a dog? They don't serve any purpose, from a technological perspective. But we know they give us a deep sense of well-being, just like a walk in the woods does. The least technology. So I think the more technology we have in our lives, the concern is that it can take us further and further away from actually what we need to thrive as human beings.
I wanted to wrap things up with one last, either a team, a club, whether it's a national team or a professional team, or even another sport as a whole, or another part of it, another industry that just shows a really good example that are sort of leading the way in terms of player workload and management when it comes to this topic. And then, I'll get one from each of you that you can think of, sort of, even if it's like a movie or a book or something that inspires you in terms of the player workload side of things. I'd love to hear it, Rich, if you want to start, and then we'll get things wrapped up.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to call out any specific organization as, being way better than the others. I think there's multiple examples of organizations doing things that are putting us on the right trajectory, as Joel talked about. The NBA definitely have looked at it, and I think they're quite innovative for sure. I know that ECB, the England Cricket Board, look at player rotational policies because of the demands of all the different formats of the game. And I think there's sports like rugby where they operate centralized contracts, things like that, which can help, I suppose, put some form of kind of ring-fenced regulations in that protect players, I suppose, again, from being overworked, overrun by the demands of the game and the schedules, et cetera. So, I think there's snippets of good work being done in different areas, for sure. There's always context, broader cultural considerations at play. And I think football being the global sport, soccer being the global sport that it is, we'll always have to kind of look for the best fit in the geographical area that it's trying to be applied to. But the principles for human well-being, as Joel's beautifully articulated on this call, remain the same. So as long as we don't lose sight of that, it can be applied for sure, for everyone to work for the best, the best outcomes of the players and the other stakeholders around it that support the players. In terms of a book, I really, really like a book called The Captain Class. It's a few years old, and it looks at actually kind of, what were the common theme or trend for the most successful teams in the last 100 years. And I don't want to spoil the outcome if you haven't read it, but I think it sings really, really nicely to lots of the points that Joel has talked about on this call, the humanistic side, which sometimes is overlooked by the shiny tech piece and the broadcaster that's got the latest data point on the TV. So that's a really, really nice book. And the book I mentioned earlier on, the Sports Perfect Storm around the business, I think that's got lots of thought provocation if you're into the business of sport as well.
Yeah. A couple of words really. I think sport is so beautiful because it's for humans by humans, right? And I think that is the essence of all sport and all high level performance. And the further we lose sight of that, I think the further we move towards something that was never intended to be. I appreciate it's a business, I appreciate it's an industry, but I think we need to, at our core, understand the human-centric nature of competition and understanding where it's come from and where it's going. I think we've kind of lost our way from that regard. I agree with Rich. I don't think I've got the mandate to call out a sports organisation or an example, but I think that would be the key message to take away. And books, avid reader. I'm a big fan of Eckhart Tolle, Power of Now, New Earth, really trying to understand what a human being is and what they've always been. And I think that for me is really the key sort of final message. And sport at its absolute best is a beautiful representation of the capabilities of human beings, the bringing together of our similarities rather than this sort of obsession with our minute differences. And I think that's the beauty of sport and football at its best. And I think that message just needs to be referred to and reminded of on occasion.
Very, very well said from both of you. The Captain Class, I'm on my last, I think 20 or 30 pages, unbelievable book. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. Gentlemen, thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it. If you have any just quick last words from each of you, and then we'll wrap things up. Rich, if you want to kick us off.
First of all, just thanks to you, Chad, for having me on, and to you, Joel, for sharing your wonderful insights. I've certainly learned a lot listening to you on this call. So, big thanks to both of you. And these topics that we've talked about today, you need to be continued to talk about. So, I encourage others to pick up the conversation and help us as humans find our best foot forward.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. Yeah, likewise, echo those sentiments. I guess Feliz Navidad here in North America from Mexico. And thank you, Chad, Brad, Rich, for your time. Really appreciate it. Great conversation. And I think a really poignant conversation at this time of year, which is often a stage where everyone sort of reflects, but also looks forward. So, yeah, thank you. Take care and look forward to the next chat.
Thanks again, guys. Talk soon.